Thanks for introducing.
Hey everybody, welcome to our fourth lecture series in the experience of. Today we're joined by Charlie, who will be discussing in the experience of architectural workers. Thanks for coming, and I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for being here, guys. My name's Charlie, and if you've come across Future Architects Front or FAF before, you've probably seen it in one of these two forms, either an Instagram page or a Twitter page. And this is because both my sort of co-founder, Priti Mohandas, and I, when we started doing FAF, we'd just finished our masters, and so we were in this position which many of you might relate to, where we were kind of looking at not just the architecture profession, but I guess the wider world as well, and seeing a sort of myriad of problems that especially young people are going to be facing as they move forwards in their lives, feeling particularly sort of disempowered in terms of how we can respond to those conditions. And so we kind of saw, I suppose, social media as one of the most direct ways for people of our age and in our position without any access to institutional power to actually try to sort of build a platform and then, leverage that platform towards the various sort of issues that we were concerned with. So because of this kind of, unconventional backstory and origin, it means that a lot of the time when we used to get asked about like what FAF is, if it's a grassroots thing, if it's social media, if it's advocacy, usually the way that, we would kind of get out of answering would just be like, yep, whatever you want it to be, that's what it is. But now we've been going for over 2 years. I think we've kind of had to finally do some reflection and try and actually stop being so facetious and figure out what we actually are. So now the way that we look at FAF is as a contemporary form of political engagement through architecture. And that's kind of revised from a form of political engagement within architecture, which is, I think, a good description of how we began. But the more we started doing this organizing, the more we started doing this work, the more we came to realize that if you set yourself architecture as a boundary to your activism, if you set yourself architecture as a boundary to your political engagement, then you're inevitably going to face a kind of dead end in the amount of real world impact you can have. And it might seem to just kind of be like a semantic difference right now, but hopefully by the end, the distinction between these two ways of framing will come to the fore. So why do we do all this? What are these sort of issues or problems that I've alluded to? Well, I probably don't really need to explain it to you guys that much, because I think especially people in their early stages of life right now, teenagers, 20-something-year-olds, can really, really, really deeply relate to this, which is that everything is on fire. Our institutions are failing us. We, can't buy a house. Rent is always going up. There's a climate crisis. Everything is both metaphorically and literally on fire. And, the way that we can kind of make ourselves feel better is maybe just be like, oh, another Starbucks while I do my render. You find your little ways to kind of console yourself within the space that you have, which, for me was and for you is architecture school. And, it's not just what we see around us, it's also like our political institutions as well. And, it's kind of captured quite nicely by, and you guys remember this lady? She was prime minister for a little bit. It's captured, I think, quite a lot through like just how sort of degraded our like political situation has become. The fact that we can have a prime minister that did not last as long as a lettuce. I think this is both a sign of how bad things have got, but it's also kind of misleading sometimes, I think, because I think it's really easy to see things like this that are just comical and maybe imagine that this is all a very recent phenomena. Like, you know, maybe it happened during Brexit is when things got bad, or maybe when Donald Trump was elected, things got bad, or maybe the 2008 financial crisis is when things got bad. But really, we have to kind of look further back in terms of the actual material origins of, you know, just how bad things have gotten for the majority of people. So this graph, I think, is really valuable to kind of think about the world of work in a more material way than we usually think about it. So work is, from an economic point of view, productivity. It is producing something that contributes to GDP, which is how we measure the success or failure of a country. And then from the point of view of a worker, the reason why you are producing something is to get a salary or a wage so you can feed yourself, so you can pay rent. And for those of you that haven't come across this sort of period of history, you can kind of see that for most of the 20th century here, productivity and salaries rose pretty consistently with one another. So the more you work, the more you get paid. Makes sense, right? Productivity is increasing because of things like technology. So whereas people around this time period, maybe they did their drawings on tracing paper, then around here, maybe they started doing them on CAD, and then now where we are, we're doing them on things like Revit and BIM. So because of things like technology and more efficient working arrangements, our productivity is always increasing, but what we're not seeing increase at the same rate is the compensation for that work. So the value we're generating is always going up because we're always generating more, but we're not seeing a share of that. So what this essentially means is that some of the value, or an increasing percentage of this value that's being generated, is not being communicated back to you through salaries. And so this is largely a kind of result of, in the 80s, the kind of neoliberal turn that both the US and the UK went through with Reagan and Thatcher. This is to do with, you know, not only things like social safety nets being taken away, but also things like labor rights being eroded, and the relationship between that and this diagram can be understood more clearly when we overlay union membership on top of productivity and compensation. So if you've never come across the word union before, which in the last year I find it hard to believe, but just to give you some context, a union is a group of workers that come together in order to build a sort of power base to negotiate with their employers. So if you want a raise and you walk into your boss's office and you say, hey, give me a raise, he'll probably just be like, no. But if you and the rest of the office walk in there and say, we all want a raise, that's a lot harder to say no to. So that's kind of the basic underlying principle of a union, which is that you collectivize your power as workers, and then you use things like strikes, industrial action, in order to negotiate for better conditions, be that pay, be that like holiday, pensions, whatever. So you can kind of see that at that period of sort of neoliberal governance in the 80s, in the UK you see, and in the US as well, you see a massive sort of attack on the labor movement, on unions from Thatcher and Reagan, and union membership as a result declines very, very steeply. And it's around this time that productivity and compensation start to decouple. So they were rising pretty much in tandem, and then around that point they decouple. And it's quite easy to sort of, you know, it's not obviously entirely causation. There's a lot of other factors tied up in this, but you can see the connection between labor power in the form of union membership and the ability of working people to ensure that their compensation rises in line with their productivity. So this is something that we can see sort of across particularly Western countries fairly consistently. The main thing that makes a difference here is different rates of like income equality in different countries will make this more or less exaggerated. So, for example, a lot of this data is from the US. If we look at the data of the UK, you can see that the one of the big issues that we face is that productivity has actually not risen too much, but we still see that if we look at median earnings, they are still very much decoupled from productivity compared to that sort of origin of the neoliberal governance. So the main problems that we face, particularly in the UK, is that there's a lot more wage inequality. So people at the top of companies are likely to be paid far better than the sort of typical employee. And also a really massive problem in the UK is the difference between income through salary and wages and income through asset price inflation. So obviously the most easy way of visualizing that in the UK is house prices. So in terms of wealth and asset ownership, which is predominantly houses and land in the UK, you can see that from 2006 to 2008 to 10 years later, 2016 to 2018, the proportion of wealth assets that are controlled by different age groups has become more and more concentrated in this top band of 65 plus. So generationally, the youngest are sort of locked out of the rising assets prices of things like housing. So this is why you can look at you can go on like Zoopla or Rightmove or whatever, and you can look at the price history of a house in, say, London, and you'll notice that the price of that house is going up so rapidly that that house is increasing in value almost certainly more than you will have been paid in a year. So you working a year and getting a year's worth of salaries will be less of a rise in value than the house price is going up. So this kind of like difference between like salaries and asset prices is also a really big aspect of this kind of both generational and class inequity in the UK. And you can see, again, how this has affected people generationally. So people born in the 1980s have the lowest levels of home ownership compared to any previous generation. And think about it, 1980s, so the people born then are in their sort of 30s, 40s now. So you can only imagine that for those of us in the room, it's probably like even worse. So that's not very encouraging. But the reason why I'm talking about all this is because it's useful to like not just like think of things being bad in this kind of like you know, the prime minister lasted longer than a lettuce way. It's important to actually understand what that means in terms of like material reality, in terms of produce, in terms of income, and in terms of the actual economic context that we're in. And you know, from that, you'll get people advocating for different things. And one of the most kind of like dangerous, I think, solutions to the situation we're in is the idea that, okay, well, if we want to increase people's income, if we want to address inequality, the best thing we can do is increase productivity. We can just keep making more, we can just keep selling more, buying more, so on, so on, so on. And the hugely important bit of context on why, one, that's not really a sound strategy anyway, but two, regardless, it is a environmentally suicidal strategy because GDP, gross domestic product, is coupled with carbon production and material extraction. And there's virtually no evidence that these can be decoupled. The tiny amount of evidence that shows that they can be decoupled is not going to happen within the amount of time that we would need to bring down carbon emissions to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 or 2 degrees. So we're in a situation where effectively we have to see GDP as coupled with carbon emissions and material extraction, and we have to think about what we're doing as a problem, not of producing more and more and more and growing forever, but of finally addressing the problem of distribution. So the problem is not just work more, produce more, buy more. It is actually getting into the real nitty-gritty of how do we plan an economy and how do we distribute the product of an economy in a more equitable and both socially and ecologically just way. So now that all that's out of the way, why, you know, now we've got like a rough idea of what we're starting from and kind of broadly, in the broadest sense, what our goal should be. Why is it so rare for architects to engage politically? And, you know, this isn't just a feeling I have. This is kind of quantitatively evidenced in things like RUAS elections. So the Royal Institute of British Architects is supposedly an organization that can represent the voice of architecture, it can lobby the government, it can make policy recommendations, etc., etc., etc. So, you know, you would think that it would be quite an important thing for us to care about and turn up to vote for. But the elections in RUAS virtually never go over 15% of the membership. And that's not even 50% of all architects, that's 50% of members of RUAS. So there is a real like political apathy amongst architects. And I think that a huge part of that is that by and large, the majority of the profession is comfortable, you know? They exist at the top of this chart of the 25 most elite occupations in the UK economy, right there above barristers and judges, above medical practitioners, above solicitors, right at the top. And privilege in this study was defined as having one or more parent in managerial positions. So, you know, you could argue, is that privileged or is that middle class, whatever. But what I think is important is that the same kind of metric was applied evenly to all of these, and architecture came out on top. And what this tells me is that while, you know, maybe architecture isn't like an incredibly, it's not a profession of millionaires maybe, but it's a profession of people who have not necessarily been hurt by the loss of public housing, the loss of the sort of youth centers. You know, they're people that have not been especially harmed by the kind of last 40 or so years of like neoliberal governance. And I think another aspect of this as well is that architectural work has kind of become, in a way, forcibly privatized and forcibly removed from the public sector in that same process of neoliberal governance. So you can see that in 1976, about half of all architects worked for the public sector. So that meant that when you finished university, if you wanted to go design something like social housing or public parks, there was a very viable route for you to do that. But then as part of the process of Thatcher's war against local government and war against sort of public spending more broadly, we have come to the point today where we've gone from 49% of UK architects working for the public sector to less than 1%. So the work of architecture has effectively become privatized across the board. So any kind of political engagement that our work would have inherently had through it being funded by public money, that has all but dried up since the 80s. This is not just a problem of architecture. Like, frankly, everything I'm talking about, you can see in the decline of the NHS, you can see it in the pay of junior doctors, you can see it in the ability of local councils to run and housing associations to do their job, things like this. So it's important to always remember that none of this is unique to architecture. This is very much a sort of statewide process where in the 80s, Thatcher started to get rid of a lot of these public corporations which would have directly benefited architects to do architectural work. Over the following decades, the funding and the amount of power that central government has is increasing and increasing and increasing. Around the time of austerity, you can see that the power of central government versus local government is actually switching. And now we're at the point where central government is funded drastically more than local government. So this is all a sort of process of like centralizing power and refusing to distribute these kinds of funds to local government and to sort of public institutions. So what can you do from the position of an architect? Because I think it's quite easy to, even if you do know about all of this and you do have this grounding in a sort of political and economic history, you can still think like, well, yeah, what do you do as a student, or what do you do as an architect? Well, I think from your position in university, I think there's two really important things to do, first of all, and that is to dispel the myths that will stop you from contributing meaningfully to this kind of political process that we need to undo some of these problems. And one of the first myths to kind of banish from yourself, your friends, and your studio is this idea of the calling. So if you've ever come across this article, it's by Marissa Courtwright for the Failed Architecture publication. And essentially, Marissa kind of describes the way that architecture is presented to us both in work and in school as something that is kind of, it's more than just a job. It's this almost like spiritual thing that you were born to do. And so because of that, you kind of put aside, your concerns about yourself or your own well-being in pursuit of the calling. And, it's quite interesting to see the ways that this manifests in the real world beyond just the way that you hold your idea of work in your own mind. Because if you think about, getting a job in architecture, you don't go to an architecture company, do you? No, you go to an architecture studio, or you go to an architecture practice, or maybe even an atelier, but you don't go to a company. A company is not what an architect does. A business isn't what an architect does. But the reality is, yeah, it is. They are companies, they are businesses, but we use the language of studio and practice and so on as a way of obfuscating the reality of architecture as work and as labor. So once you've kind of got past that and you're thinking like, yep, I've got it, architecture's political, I'm fully on board, viva la revolution, all of that, the next kind of problem that a lot of architects face is then starting to see everything as architecture and everything as a political process to be addressed through architecture. And in this piece by Leila Hanrahan, the title kind of summarizes it perfectly. While all design is political, not all politics is design. So the next thing to kind of try and start to embody as a student, both through the work you're doing, but also through the reading you're doing, and eventually the work that you'll be doing, is to acknowledge that while there are things that can be addressed politically through design, there are also very concrete limits to design at the same time. So you might want, as an architect, to design public housing, but are you going to be able to design your way to there being public housing? No. Because the reason the public housing is no longer funded and built is purely political. It's got nothing to do with productive capacity. It's got nothing to do with the skills to do it. It's got nothing to. It's not a design problem. It's a political problem. So we have to realize that there are some things that we can do in our role as designers. There are some things that design practice is effective at accomplishing. But if we want to do something like build public housing again, we have to go beyond our role as designers and start to operate politically as well as designers. So to give you a bit of an overview of like some ways that we've, I guess, tried to do this using our very, very limited resources, to give you a bit of backstory of like, what FAF started out as and what it turned into. So originally it was just supposed to be a sort of platform for gathering data about the profession and the things that we thought were wrong with the profession. And because we were sharing this kind of material, it meant that people would start sending us their experiences of working in practice. So in sharing the data on this, we were then also like bombarded with more and more data. And so the Instagram page became almost a sort of confessional for architectural workers to share their experiences of being in the profession. And I think what this effectively did was this started to kind of build solidarity between people who didn't know each other, but they kind of saw their experiences reflected through others through the platform. This was, kind of captured through an open letter that we wrote to the Royal Institute of British Architects. So, we put out a survey that asked a set of questions to try and get an understanding of what it was like to be a graduate in architecture today. So questions like, have you ever done unpaid overtime? You can see almost everyone says, yes, I have done unpaid overtime. Does your salary allow you to live comfortably? Almost everyone is saying, no, it does not allow me to live comfortably. And then maybe the most damning of all is, do you feel supported by REBA? In which case it was like 96% no. So they, as a group that supposedly refers to themselves as the voice of architecture, we thought that they were a good kind of target for an open letter to share some of this data and some of these experiences that we'd collected. So from the data and from the over 120 experiences that we put at the end of the open letter, we kind of synthesized all of that down into 5 demands that we wanted to make of the institution. So to end unpaid overtime in their charter of practices, to provide more oversight for the architectural assistant role, to have greater transparency in their budget and spending, to work towards a more representative governing body, and to introduce accountability for exploitative practices. This was backed by over 1,800 signatures, which we gathered in 2 weeks, which, considering I think FAF had like 400 followers at the time, is I think speaks to the support for these demands. And in case you were wondering, they met with us. They said that, yes, we totally agree. We're going to definitely consult on ending unpaid overtime. And then, unsurprisingly, for an institute such as this, they said they'd do it. They published on their website that they were going to do it. They never did it. So we decided after that point, well, okay, if we can't, rely on the goodwill of the people leading this institute, then let's just try and get new people leading the institute. So we, alongside other groups like the Architecture Union, UVW SAW, Architects Climate Action Network, previous members of the REBA Future Architects Student Group, a whole bunch of us came together and launched an initiative to elect a new REBA president who, unlike every other REBA president, was not a owner of a company, was not a boss, but was actually a worker like most architects are. And so we set out a list of sort of, campaign points that we wanted people to support through their candidacy. We hosted our own internal hustings, and eventually a guy, Moiwa Oki, won our sort of like internal election that we ran. And then he became the person that we supported in the proper REBA election. And again, in case you missed it, he won. So we're now at the point where Moy was going to be coming in as the new REBA president this September. He'll be the first worker president, the first black man to be president, the youngest president, and all of this, was accomplished by just leveraging the sort of digital landscape that we have at our fingertips now. We've also worked with the ARB, the Architects Registration Board, specifically around education. So we did a similar survey to the one I spoke about with Reba about the way that education might change in the future in order to respond to social and ecological crises. We ended up talking to the ARB about the work that we'd done, and this was incorporated into an early consultation that they had. They then opened this consultation up to everyone, and we were able to direct loads of people to respond to that consultation about what they'd like to see in the future of architectural education. And what that eventually amounted to was the ARB announcing that they would try to incorporate what they called the most significant changes to architectural education in 50 years. And this was about, a year, just a bit over a year ago now. They've since announced what they want those changes to be. I think they've scaled back the ambition quite drastically from talking to institutions and stakeholders, but the encouraging thing now is that they've opened up another consultation about what they're, how ambitious they should be going forwards. So if you do want them to, if you do want to see architectural education changed, if you do want to see it become more diverse, accessible, things like this, make sure you respond to their consultation, which is open right now. Because the only way to get the ball rolling on things like this is to get as many people responding to it as possible. So how did we actually do this? How do we leverage these, big, old, slow institutions? Well, a lot of it was done just through using the language of the internet and the language of, sort of millennial and Gen Z people, which was memes. And, a lot of people will probably look at this and be like, it's a bit lowbrow. And I would say, yes, that's the point. The point is that it is accessible. The point is that it is simple. The point is that it's easy to get. The point is that the bar to being involved in this kind of critique and this kind of organizing should be as low as possible. So, we try to both do, very serious, big-scale organizing through, campaigning, through open letters, through things like this. But at the end of the day, the way of building momentum for that needs to be accessible, and you need to be able to get kind of complex points across in ways that just kind of click with people. And if you can make it fun and entertaining at the same time, that's a win-win. So this is why a lot of the stuff you'll see on the FAF page is kind of both juvenile as well as meaningful. So that's how we do it. That's how we kind of leverage our position, which again, like I said, we still don't have any institutional power. We still are just leveraging the power of social media and everything that we do. But if you want to join something that has a bit more sort of grounding than we do, then I would definitely recommend the Architecture Union, UVW SAW. So they, as any union would, are kind of constantly working to try and improve the conditions of architectural workers. So they have demands, just like we do, of ending unpaid overtime. They do casework to support people when they've been unfairly dismissed from their jobs. They are an amazing, amazing group, and I highly recommend you all join them. You can join them as a student if you want, or you can join them once you join practice, but either way, I would definitely encourage that. They're not just about organizing and union work. They do also work a lot around education and understanding our position in the profession better, and also our position in terms of things like climate crisis, things like this. So it's generally just a really amazing group to be part of, even if you have no need for the union organizing aspect of it. It's just a really great group of people with a lot of solidarity and support. There's also the Architects Climate Action Network. So if you're particularly motivated by issues of climate and biodiversity, then this is probably the perfect group for you. So ACAN emerged when people in practice realized that they couldn't pursue meaningful climate action through their workplaces. This is probably not surprising to you, because as a company and as a business, the thing that most architects have to prioritize is finance. It is a return on investment. So if you want to do meaningful climate action, you're always having to do that secondary to financial decision making. So these guys made ACAN as a way of being able to organize directly around climate rather than having to do it as sort of afterthought in their private practice. And yeah, so one of the last things I'll leave you with is, again, yeah, I know that like a lot of the times in these kinds of lectures, it's like, okay, yeah, whatever, that worked for you, that's great, but like this will never work for me, like, or like it's going to take too long, or so on, so on, so on. And I think this is a really good example of like how quickly you can start kind of making traction just by like getting organized even in the most rudimentary, like even in the most simple way. Because we started FAF, the FAF account was created on the 31st of January, I think. And this was a message that we got from Reba 4 days after creating the account. So thanks for sharing the open letter. We'll be in touch in due course, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, like 4 days of making an Instagram account was what it took to get the Reba to respond directly to the open letter that we'd written. So yeah, I hope that that maybe helps to kind of illustrate that it is very, very, very possible to start building a kind of political momentum and some organizational capacity, you know, no matter where you're starting from. And I think this sums it all up quite well, which is a quote from Catherine Heron, which says, architects have to work from a political base, and if there isn't one, you have to start it. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. Recently the ARB announced that American qualifications are going to be counted.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that. Would you like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think anything that means people can move and work where they want easier, I guess, is a good thing. Yeah, like at the end of the day, I guess it's probably not much of a, like, it doesn't personally make me feel a lot better when I think about like the loss of free movement in Europe, for example. But like, you know, it's I'm sure it's good. Like it's good to try and I think break down any kind of like redundant or unnecessary gatekeeping in something like a profession, because so much of a profession is like ring fencing like knowledge or work, which sometimes is absolutely necessary. But in the case of architecture, I think it's very, especially in the UK, it really doesn't make a huge amount of sense, because like while the title is protected very strictly, right? Architectural work is not protected. Like, I don't know if you guys knew that. Like, architectural work is not protected at all. So anyone can do the work of an architect. The only thing they can't do is say they're an architect while they're doing it. But, so which is kind of ludicrous, right? Because it's surely the only point of protecting the title would be to have some kind of like safeguards on what kind of design work or what kind of building work gets carried out. But there's building codes for that. There's like building safety standards for that. So, you know, you kind of get to the point where you're like, well, what is the profession and what is the title of architect for then? So if we have building safety for like quality control and things like that, what does the title of architect do? Well, historically, what it's done is it's acted as a way of enclosing knowledge, right? So architects as workers, all you have to get an income is you sell your labor, right? So how can a profession earn more than a blue-collar worker? Well, what they can do is they can take a piece of important knowledge or skills and they can kind of enclose it. And then it's almost like the enclosure of land. Like once you enclose it, you can then kind of like charge rent on it as you sort of loan it out or use it. So architecture and a lot of professions operate according to this model where they're able to have a higher income because they have enclosed and gate-kept knowledge. But we're in a position now with architecture where the knowledge and the skills are no longer gatekept. That's why architects get so frustrated with developers all the time, right? It's because they get to do the same work we do. And this isn't really a call for gatekeeping. It's more of a call for like, you know, it's time to actually now realize that you shouldn't have to gatekeep and enclose knowledge in order to, you know, have a livable wage and do good work. Like that should just be a standard for everyone. But you know, that's why I think you see things like all of the knots that people get tied into over the title of architect. Yeah, I think what's mutual recognition, I think, is what it's called, that we have now with the US. I think it's good, but it doesn't, I don't know if it necessarily resolves some of the fundamental problems of like, you know, no protection of work plus no organized labor to keep conditions improved. But yeah, I don't know if that answered your question at all.
Yeah, I mean, I was more thinking along the lines of, do you think it's going to be easier or harder to get American architects on board with the way that we're thinking here?
I think there's not that massive a difference really. Like I think, as far as I can tell, like most of the people I know practicing in the US have a lot of the same problems as we do. Like they also have to follow like real estate speculation for an enormous percentage of their work. They're also educated in a very socially minded way, but are then kind of, you know, launched out into basically like a very predatory land and real estate market that architecture has to operate within. So I think that, yeah, I don't think there would be a massive like gap in terms of what American architectural workers and British architectural workers from like the position that they'd be coming from, as far as I know at least. Yeah.
When it comes to using the language of the internet,
Yep.
Do you not fear that maybe sometimes that like we could potentially say create a meme that uses irony and then it's counterproductive to what you're actually trying to say or do?
Yeah, I mean it could happen. I guess the only thing we have to go off is the evidence of what has happened, and so far they seem to have been pretty effective. But you know, we do. It's funny. We actually don't. I think like a lot of people expect that we get like constant pushback and like real like aggressive retaliation from like bosses or people higher up in the profession, but we actually really don't get that much at all. I think the most common critique we get is more of like a kind of like tone policing critique where, yeah, someone will think we're being too mean or we're being, you know, too jokey about something. And, you know, at the end of the day, like my general response is like, it looks to me like it's working. If you want to try it your way that's more polite, please do. And then if that works well, we'll learn from you and we'll do it that way. But I think for any kind of like grassroots organizing, I think you have to kind of be very responsive in terms of like method. So like if something seems to be working, you know, you can't really look a gift horse in the mouth. If you don't have any institutional power, you have to kind of just like go with the kind of organizing and the kind of like messaging that connects with people for whatever reason. Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to ask again, you had a poster up there of one of the events that you were collaborating with a bunch of other groups. Yeah, that one. And I was just curious about what it's like being a community organizer within a community of architects which really don't see each other all that much outside their own studio.
So, sorry, like what is it like to be organizing in a profession where people are not very social, do you mean? Or
yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. I think it's like amazing. Like if anything, it feels more therapeutic because there's that. Like there's a couple of like architectural activists from the 20th century that I really admire. One of which is a guy called I Kiyoshi Kuromiya, and he was an architecture student from Cornell, I think, or maybe somewhere else, I can't remember, but somewhere in the US. And he, from his beginnings as an architect, ended up in the civil rights movement, in like working with like the Black Panthers. He was like one of the first people to start campaigning for like better research and treatment around AIDS, and he had like an amazing life, and he had a very hard life at the same time, and he ended up sort of dying of terminal cancer. And one of his last sort of quotes was, I'm a, for however many years, cancer survivor, and I really believe that activism is therapeutic. And obviously, I don't have anything even remotely as hard as that to deal with in my life, but I still do feel the truth of that activism and organizing and forming this kind of solidarity is therapeutic, because I think it is really psychologically damaging, I think, to always be in these like commodified roles where you're selling your labor, you're paying rent, you can't meet someone unless you're paying for a coffee, there's no public space, everything's privately owned, everything's commodified. I think it is really like deeply exhausting in a way that we can't quite acknowledge because we live in it all the time. And spaces like this, for me, are incredible because they're spaces where you can actually go above that like commodified, very capitalistic way of like seeing ourselves and each other and the world around us, and you can actually connect on solidarity, on principles of like organizing towards a more distributive economy and world. So I personally find this kind of group not only important in terms of like the work and the organizing is important materially, but also very important for my own like well-being. Like I think I'm so much better off as an individual doing this kind of work than I would be without it.
So this is your full-time job?
God, no. No. You think I get paid for this? No. No. I work for a group called CIVIC SQUARE, which is a community interest company based in Birmingham, and they're not an architecture practice, but they are kind of like a group that advocates for specific built environment policy. So the work I do there is largely around like retrofit and community organizing towards things like street-based governance and thinking about like what a just transition would look like for the built environment, and kind of just acknowledging the fact that, I think it's 90% of the houses that will exist by 2050 already do exist. So in terms of climate transition, it makes sense to think more about the ones that do exist rather than the ones that are going to exist. So that's kind of the world that I have moved into in terms of my full-time work. And so luckily for me, I was able to, make a good transition. I did work as a part one. I have worked in classic architectural practice. I was very lucky to find a place that kind of aligned very well with the kind of stuff I wanted to do. Yeah.
So this is unpaid overtime.
It's not overtime because that would imply that there is paid time. It's just unpaid in general. But you'll be happy to know that the Student Society has paid me to be here right now. So this right now is not unpaid. This is one of the rare instances where FAF is paid. So huge props to you guys for that one. That is the truth of activism, sadly. Like the incumbent system that we exist within is not gonna pay you to break it down and build something else. It is unjust, but like the way another guy that I really admire, the second of those 20th century figures I mentioned before, was a guy called Roel Wallenberg, and he was a Swedish son of like a bank owner and a diplomatic family, and he also studied architecture in the US, and then he ended up going to work as a sort of, he graduated during the Great Depression. There was no architecture job, so he ended up working as a sort of correspondent to diplomats, and he went to what was at the time Nazi-occupied Hungary, and he essentially used his, privilege and connections, but also his like architectural and design background to save, I think, what was estimated to be like 100,000 people from like death camps. And like basically the reason why I'm bringing him up at all is because I think he's a really great example of why when we do have privilege, we shouldn't see it as a thing that means we have to like shy away from conversations of like equity and justice. If anything, it's a reason why you need to commit to it even further, because we need people to leverage, like big or small, whatever privilege they have, we need people to leverage that in order to do this kind of work. So the fact that I have a kind of flexible full-time job now means that I can come and do this on what day is it? Thursday? Yeah, God. It means I can come and do this on a Thursday and I don't have to worry about like being at the office early tomorrow. Yeah, I think it's the stories like Raoul Wallenberg's like good examples for me to think about, kind of thinking of privilege not as like this thing you should just feel guilty about, but thinking of it as like, if you have to think about your life as like reaching a bar to survive and pay rent and feed yourself, and then everything above that is like surplus time and energy, like that is privilege essentially. The more people have of that, the more privileged they are. Think of that as something that you can then leverage towards doing work like this or doing whatever. So it is unpaid, but yeah, that's just activism for you. If you can find a way to get paid for it, let me know. Yeah. Cool.
Well, thank you, Charlie, for a really great talk, and thank you all for coming. This is the last lecture series for the Easter break, and we will be back with more in the summer term. So thank you for coming, and we have a good evening.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much.